Round 2 of thesis about to begin. Get your seat now. The seats are going quick. Is that okay, Ralph? Lunch is okay? Everyone, thank you for being here for the second round of theses today. We're going to begin now at 2, and we're going to go through 5 p.m. There are 3 projects that we're going to look at. We're going to look at a project on this wall, We're going to turn and look at a project on that wall. Magically, Carol Merrill will be over here flipping the panels around, and we'll have a new project on this wall at 4 p.m. and we'll conclude around 5 p.m. We have some new reviewers joining us. I'm just going to ask all of the reviewers to reintroduce themselves because the afternoon of thesis students doesn't always have the opportunity to spend in the morning to know who their critics in the afternoon might be. So I'm going to start over here with my good friend, Michael Marshall.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Michael Marshall Design is my firm based here in DC. I have a long standing time involved with the University of Maryland's Architecture School, and it's always great coming back. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Mika Yamaguchi with the ZGF Architects, also in DC. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana McKinney-White. I'm an assistant professor of urban design at the Harvard GSD and former UMD faculty member. Glad to be here.
Hi, I'm Juanita Lee. I'm at Air St. Gross and recent alumni.
Hello, my name is Craig Spangler. I'm a senior principal at Ballinger from Philadelphia and a 1982 graduate of the school.
I'm Brian Grebe. I'm a 2001 graduate of University of Maryland. Have my own practice in Annapolis and also a faculty member at Morgan State up in Baltimore.
I'm David Gavin. I am an associate architect at Quinn Evans Architects in Baltimore, also in DC, and I was a 2012 graduate from University of Maryland.
And the reason these gentlemen are joining us late in the afternoon, and as well as Juanita, is that we just had a celebration for Professor Amy Gardner, who is retiring this year after an amazing career. And we spent 2 hours at lunch and roasted her, and now we have had a lot of coffee and we're all ready to go. So this group is going to be a pushover, Maggie. We have Maggie Boland. She's going to be doing a Cutting Edge Learning Center in Washington, D.C. Her chair of her committee was Professor May, joined as well by Professor Burke and myself. Take it away.
Thank you so much. All right. So I would like to start off by saying thank you to Lindsay, Brian, and Juan for their help. I wouldn't have gotten here today without them. So anyway, now I will present Cutting Edge Early Development Center. So the goal with this was to create physically and emotionally safe spaces for children and their caregivers, to kind of see it in a larger lens and catalyze a positive transformation in the country's childcare infrastructure. So just looking at the larger context, there's kind of a bigger issue behind this, and that is the US's childcare system. So in a study on where the richest countries stand on childcare, the US ranked 40th out of 41. And these looked at leave, access, quality, and affordability. And where we ranked the lowest is in leave and affordability, which kind of goes to show that this is regarded as more of an individual and parent problem rather than a societal problem. Which has been proven to not be the case. If you see that there are economic impacts on the parents themselves as well as businesses, and then it gets down to the taxpayer. And so in looking at whose problem this should be necessarily, it gets to kind of the government and where they spend their money currently. And one of those places is sort of ironic in a sense. They spent double the budget on federal law enforcement than they did on childcare, which is relevant for a few reasons. If you look at kind of how the brain develops over time, it pretty much happens all within your first 5 years of life, yet only 14% of public education funding is spent on early childhood education. And this has proven that if more money was put into this, then it would ultimately save taxpayers about 7 times as much. So going from that super complicated issue with the government's budget back to sort of making this a simple issue in the sense that children are often neglected in public spaces. And as you can see in this historic photograph, it can be so simple and things can be made easy for them to be in public spaces. And so this is kind of what the goal would be, whereas the current situation involves a lot of talking about the issue and not as much action, all with the same questions of whose problem is it. So in looking at choosing a site for this project, I looked in Washington, D.C. for its location as the capital, as well as it has the most expensive childcare in the country. And in looking at the DC school system in general, there actually is a precedent for doing a project like this with Michelle Rhee and her time as the chancellor of DC Public Schools in 2007. She looked to really make an impact on public schools at the time when they were looking like the worst in the country, and had, although a controversial sort of impact, it was still beneficial and had a national effect, which would be the goal with this. So here is just a section showing the two streets that divide the site that I'm looking at, one of which being North Capitol, which of course looks down at the dome of the Capitol, and then the other being First Street, which borders McMillan Reservoir and also has sites to the Washington Monument. So it's kind of in between where the country makes its decisions and like what represents our ideals. Looking more specifically around the site, it is surrounded by public institutions or private institutions like Howard and Catholic, as well as Children's National Hospital, Washington Hospital Center, and then also the reservoir itself, which is currently under development and will add a lot of housing and density to this area. So here you can see the before and after of how this area will change, this being the community center in the southern end, on the southern end of the site. And so here is a kind of a plan of that, and it's called the Reservoir District, and what will be going there is new healthcare facilities to complement the existing hospitals, 472 apartment units, 146 townhomes, and then finally the community center in the south. And kind of looking back at the history of the reservoir, it started off as a sand filtration site and has these underground vaults underneath the entirety of that park. And you can see here in Olmsted's original plan, there are 29 of those, 26 of them residing in the half on the other side of First Avenue. Another thing involved in this was a design for a children's lawn and a children's playground, which was used up until, I believe, the 1940s until it was closed off. And you can see how that has changed today, in that it was once a park space and has become a closed off parking lot. So the history of children in this area is here. So kind of going from that and looking at another historical photograph, which shows a protest in New York City on childcare, you can see that they were facing the same issues that we are now, all surrounded on 4 different users, being the child, the caregiver, the parent, and the whole community. So in looking at these, those became kind of the basis for the project and the main goals. So with the child, promoting healthy child development, which can have a positive impact on the community overall. So looking at physical, cognitive, and emotional development and how to support those with architecture. Then also improving current injury prevention methods. So at home, in the sense of counseling services, and then within the facility itself, and then also in between, so transportation methods. And then with the caregivers, as a super labor heavy industry, they're often neglected in these spaces. So prioritizing them in terms of their professional, mental, and physical health. And then finally, the community at large, and making it a convenient, inclusive, and sustainable place, as well as benefiting all of these users will benefit the community overall. So looking at those user-driven objectives and then the site again, we get to sort of this development of how the plan arrived and the design started. So here is that lower southern end of the site, which this is the new, this is what is being constructed, is actually almost done with construction, that community center. And as you can see, there's an existing structure, which are those sand filter vaults underneath the ground. And so I look to use those as kind of like a structural system. And then from there, determine site axes and then the necessary lot coverage, which is determined by square footage per child within the center. And that's in terms of outdoor space as well as indoor. And then from there, oh, there we go. You can see the first floor and its position on the site and how the different classroom, oh, sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay, so one big consideration was both the drop-off and pickup, so how it could relate to the existing neighborhoods around as well as support this new development in the north. And so one thing that was considered was whether you're driving or walking to the center and how you arrive at that main lobby space. So as you can see there, the drop-off actually goes underground. The drive-ins go underground into those kind of vaulted areas, and then the walk-ins come in from the north into the lobby space here. And then another thing to consider is which age groups are able to be on which floors. So this will currently provide for children's anywhere from birth through a preschool, so before the age of like 5. And none of the kids above the age or under the age of 30 or 24 months could be on the second floor due to egress reasons. So the second floor really became an opportunity for caregivers and kind of the family spaces to have a division while still remaining visual connection with the children's spaces. And then, okay. So, and then seeing how all these different users will experience the space based on kind of more architectural forms and things. One thing that was necessary to consider is the different scales involved. So thinking about a children's scale and their vantage point and how that will change their experience within the space and how you can provide opportunities for them at their ground level as opposed to the typical 5'5". So here we can see it's typical to consider the child care center a home away from home for these children, as some spend up to 9 hours a day there and can spend over 12,000 hours there before they reach school. And so one thing to consider was how to create a more transitional entry, no matter which entry, whether it's from the outdoor play areas or the main entrance at the front. Creating porches and overhangs help to balance the harsh transitions there. And then also using kind of greenery and natural materials to do that as well. And then once you enter the lobby space, you can see how this perspective in particular is taken at more of a children's eye level. And the spaces themselves are designed to kind of complement this specific eye level with window seats and transitions on the stairs as well. And then also constantly having a visual tie through the corridor, as the corridor can be the main social space within the center, and can provide different interactions between age groups, although they might be separated at most times of the day. So here we can see a zoomed in version, which shows a little bit about how the children's physical development is played into the design a bit, which is providing really minimal ramps so that they can climb and explore those, as well as niches off to the side that allow for more private interactions, which can support their emotional development. And this is that main corridor that connects the age groups all together. And so this is where they would experience the other, not their own age group as much, so. Okay, so then here we'll zoom into one of the specific classrooms, which is the infant one at the front. So you can see here that there are visual connections to other classrooms as well, but ones that can be closed off if caregivers need to, as well as different ceiling height changes depending on the level of activity within the space, and then also providing ledges near windows so that they can also see outside and the windows aren't above their heads. And then using curves to flow into spaces that might be more intimidating or not as open so that they feel like smoother transitions. And so then next, looking at the parents and the caregivers a bit more. One thing is it was necessary to not only look at the child scale because of the other people that will be using the facility. So in looking at how you can kind of design for both eye levels and see the differences between them, and it creates a different reality based on where your eye meets a horizon. And so, yeah, looking at the caregivers and their corridor, which is on the second floor, it was less about the social interactions and more about egress and thinking about that, and looking at codes and the minimum for codes and how they can be developed to better meet the needs of the caregivers. One in particular being the width of corridors, which is typically determined based on the width of a person. Yet in these cases, oftentimes, the caregivers will be holding a child, and that increases their width and is something that should be accounted for. So whether this is the correct width or not, the minimum of 48 inches is definitely not enough to fit two caregivers holding children out. So. And then finally, looking at all of these come together in the community and using the space to support the surrounding infrastructure as well. It really looks to create a tie with the community center to the east and offers these two bookends like sunrooms that pull views through and just allow for a more transitional space between the community center and the reservoir. And so then finally, just to go back to the original goal, which was to create physically and emotionally safe spaces for children to catalyze a positive transformation in the country's childcare infrastructure. And so with that, I will open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you, Maggie. And just a reminder to the reviewers to speak into the microphone and pass it around as who would like to take it first. How about the newbie?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Maggie, for that wonderful presentation. I wonder, first of all, I'd like to ask, are you a parent?
No.
Did you have an opportunity to visit some early childhood centers?
Yep.
I'm wondering a little bit about this entry, the northern entrance. I really feel like the site plan and thinking about the circulation and the relationship to the community center is really thoughtful. Creating this space in the center where you have oversight into the children's play is really thoughtful. But one of the things you'll find about education spaces is that security is a really big concern right now. I'm a little concerned about how porous the northern entrance is. And I understand from like a poetic point of view, it makes a lot of sense to create more connectivity with the community, but there's also requirements about making sure children don't wander off. So that's a challenge of like, how do you create this inviting threshold and also think about security? So I'm just wondering if you, what kind of research that you put into that?
Yeah, I think most of my research there revolved around having like one primary entrance and then separate ones for different classrooms in case of emergency. But using that primary entrance, like kind of as, in my research, I just found that as you would any other one, just that it kind of needed to be surrounded by certain program elements like the director's office, administration desk. And so that's kind of all the thought that was there for that. But one thing that did go back and forth a lot was whether the entrance sat on the north or a different side, and it was a back and forth process for sure. But
I'd also like think about, as you're putting this into your portfolio, whether the east entrance off of the play area, it doesn't look gated off. And since that's a primary play area, that might be something to consider, is how it's secured. It's just, I love the wide corridors. I would really encourage you to find photos of how preschool teachers corral kids, because they will literally like leash them together, like 20 at a time. And it's really cute and adorable, but I actually am wondering if 8 feet is even enough, because you see them walking down the sidewalk and it's like, it's a train of kids. It's really fascinating. So, but congratulations.
thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about how you organize the building form with the community center on this plateau? What defined the edge and what constraints were you under to defining that edge? Because part of this seems like, it is from a security perspective, has to be defined, right? But the same token, it's sitting as a kind of public entity on this plateau. And it doesn't feel like it's picking up any cues from the community center about those two things coming together as a unit. Architecturally, it doesn't respond to it from a language perspective, and from a planning perspective, it doesn't seem to align. And just you're thinking about that as a fundamental.
Yeah, I think so. Part of the reason it ended as it did was just because I wanted the form to be still opening towards the community center. So I didn't want to face the park or play area towards the reservoir and have the building like a kind of butt up to the community center. And I played around with like sinking it or raising it in some way like the community center does, but that felt as if it was creating a building edge itself. And so there was just kind of a desire to not close off that corner, but with children and security reasons, obviously there does need to be a fence. So it was a tough kind of call there.
So could you speak a little bit about the language of the architecture and how you approach that? And how does that tie to a child? Like the facades and the forms and the like.
So a lot of that came from the underground structure, which has these, beautiful vaults. And although the ones underneath my building have already been kind of demolished, I wanted to tie back in that language and using more like round forms in addition to the more 90-degree angles to offer like more visual simulation. And if you see in the caregiver corridor, I also look to kind of manipulate those vaults and turn them into window seats so that that same idea can come across, but used in like a different way.
So just a couple other comments. You've talked about this main street, and architecturally, the kind of primary driver goes in the opposite direction, at least from a spatial perspective where the stair is, right? Like there's a cross axis that comes across. So it becomes, when you're looking at the plan, it appears to be what I would imagine to be Main Street, right? In terms of how you formalize it, just because of it's the largest piece, and the one that goes up and down the plan, north-south, tends to be, it starts to lose between its primary objective, inside and outside, and it sort of just ends at the end of a, another kind of space, and isn't the kind of primary organizer of the plan, yet it's the thing that you're relying on as a basis for organizing the child experience. And so for me, it's just, it's curious because I don't know whether or not the plan is reading for what you're trying to recognize as the kind of primary organizing thing. And then the second issue is that one of the biggest things, especially with early childhood, is external play. And that tends to be the more dominant condition of a precinct, if you will, around it, that yet it's kind of the smallest component. And I just, in context of imagining what the exterior was, so kids playing externally, why did you make it so small?
So the original square footage for that was determined by just like a square footage per child. But then I actually increased that because I didn't personally feel like it was enough. So it's larger than it should be for the amount of children that this facility kind of provides for. But I think another thing is that scaling the size of certain spaces to children is kind of difficult to comprehend. Like another example would be the lobby space, because you want to, like, I had this tendency to want to make it like this grand space, but then you have to think about the child entering, and it can't just be like double height ceilings everywhere. So I thought about that too with the play yard, and that's another reason that it kind of, the building itself has a few different twists and turns, is because it provides different play areas for the different age groups so that they can be separate or together, depending on the time of day, because they're all on different schedules typically.
So you have some. Yeah, so I'm probably going to repeat a couple of the comments that were already made. Going back to the whole concept of the main street, I think conceptually it's a great idea. Going back to the earlier comments, I would like to see it even expand upon even further. Maybe seeing additional diagrams formulated around that main street and how each of the individual spaces sort of engages that main street, because that, as a parent myself, as I come in for pickup and drop off, coming in through the lobby and being able to, have that view down, watch the caretakers bring your child up and things like that. It's all really important, having that big visual access. I think I sort of have the fortune and misfortune both of knowing the site particularly well. I happen to work for the firm that's doing the community center, and knowing how, even though it is this big, great, expansive space, it's actually very interesting sectionally, and I would have liked to see a little bit more of how you could have utilized that into, how you're siting the building, how you're carving into it, how you're utilizing a lot of those existing, those extant elements that are around there, because this southern end of the site is in fact quite high up on a plinth. And as you're on First Street, as you're on Channing Street, how those sort of slopes up, they are a wall urbanistically, and so how it engages with the actual city street grid itself as well would be something I would like to see explored more.
Thank you for your presentation. As someone who's in need of the childcare soon, I'm thinking about your project and wondering a little bit about how you have resolved some of the architecture, specifically in terms of just the building height and like this the square footage of the space that you created. It seems like it's quite generous given how many kids are going to be in here?
108.
How many classrooms are there?
There's 2 for each age group, so there's 8.
I don't think, have you looked at the laws for it? Because I'm pretty sure most classrooms can only have, for like infants, can only have 8.
Yeah, there's 8 in the infant rooms, 12 in each of the young toddlers, 14 in each of the older toddlers, and then again 14 in the preschoolers.
Okay. I think we're missing a diagram of that. Yeah. I think a little bit more clarity as to how many kids are being accommodated. It seems like the space is quite generous, but at the same time, I'm wondering, could it have even been more? Just given it seems quite residential in scale. Like I'm looking at this rendering of First Ave, and it almost looks like an LA mansion, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just I'm wondering if it could have more less of like a residential sort of feeling to it, and if maybe having greater density within the building itself, if you can kind of even more aggressively combat some of the concerns you were addressing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a similar kind of related comment. What I find interesting is that there was a lot of emphasis on the different heights, like eye level, and the counter height, the chair height, and I'm not really seeing that reflected so much in the interior renderings. And then we also have very grand spaces with the heights actually quite generous, considering. So yeah, I'm curious about the emotionally safe spaces and how you're sort of determining that and as it relates to these other interior moments.
Yeah, so those came out of just different spaces that were either like pushed or pulled for different reasons. So they almost like created themselves. But that was one thing in my research that I found that a lot of centers don't usually provide for, is that they'll create like the large social spaces, but that children also need different spaces to be alone. So that was kind of a bigger priority. And one thing that I did think about was, if you see kind of in surrounding that large lobby space, there are these curved sort of areas on the sides, and those were all kind of in support of that idea too. So
Yeah, I think a diagram kind of explaining, because I feel like you did a lot of work that we can't really read here. So I think the next level of information would really elevate our understanding just visually, especially program and like just, yeah, labeling the rooms, programming and circulation, I think would help clarify a lot. And then getting to integrate those, yeah, like the emotionally safe spaces. I'm really interested in that. And I had a feeling that those curved interior walls had something to do with it, especially with like neurodiversity and other like differently abled children can really benefit from different, thinking about interior spaces differently. So yeah, thank you.
You know, it's interesting looking at it because it's such a collage. It looks like there was an original building and then a series of additions. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's just sort of interesting that it looks like that. But this is a blank site, right?
Yeah.
This is all composed from zero.
yes.
Can you talk about that? Is that because of to keep the scale or
It is in a way. Also, it's kind of something that happens with these sort of centers, and it's actually like a technique called a cluster technique, and like that you cluster classrooms, and it sort of like creates this shift and pull. And so it actually wasn't something that I was initially aiming to do, but in sticking to the certain square footages and things, it almost kind of created itself.
well, you use the word cluster. There are all sorts of clusters as a party, as a concept for buildings. doesn't quite look like that. Meaning,
Right.
at least when I hear cluster, it means that there are components that repeat.
Right.
And then through the repetition, it starts to maybe shape space or have an identity. Where this, there's something about it, even in your massing and the elevations and in the plan. So, so that was just a question. Why is it like that? Is it, because it's something that the kids will feel better in, less institutional, and someone said earlier, kind of residential. So it's like home.
Yeah. Like having kind of a main, almost like living space, and then different areas that branch out from there is sort of another way to look at it.
Okay. It reminds me of the buildings in Cleveland Park. And they're kind of Victorian, but then there might be additions to it, and then it's repurposed. It's no longer a residence, but it now has this academic use. So it has that effect. I think instead of the flat roofs, it might have been even more interesting to have pitched roofs and, more of a village, if you will, on that plateau.
Yeah, that was another thing that was interesting to think about is, originally I did have a bunch of sloped roofs, and then I got a comment that, not everyone's image of like home is the same. And even though mine is of like pitched roofs, not every child, especially in an urban environment, will feel the same. So, but that was definitely a thought as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I want to add one thing. Folks arriving underneath, right? One thing I didn't pick up on and now appreciate in your section is the nature of the underground here and how potentially beautiful it is. But you said you eliminated it in context of yours, yet it was one of the things that seemingly, if you're trying to reflect in the balance of the architecture, would be something you would experience upon arrival. If you're arriving in a garage, dropping off in a garage, picking up in a garage, the beauty of being able to drive in here, albeit it may not be efficient, but it was there, that being able to take advantage of it as a kind of thing to experience underground, for which none of the other things, no one else can see it here, but that would be something that would give the thing a real resonance of place. Wow, just a comment, just realizing that, that's such an important part of how you engage, the parents engage with this is that, and then the transition from there up through the building, with the kids make their way up,
So I think some people have said some of this of what I'm going to say, but maybe take a little bit different approach to what I'm seeing. But to me, I think you definitely need more diagrams. And I imagine there's lots of diagrams that didn't make it up to this wall from your time that you've spent studying this. But, if I look at the bottom left corner, that diagram that kind of has this like kind of radiating out these concentric circles is like, I see this idea about protection, play, creativity. And I wonder if your scheme is more about, like, it should have gone more of a direction about focusing on the courtyard, which to me, like, I see in that diagram, that bottom left diagram, and really pushed up the idea of what the courtyard could have been, because you kind of have a courtyard, but you kind of don't have a courtyard. And I just see like kind of the playfulness, the creativity, the imagination, that protection, that cocoon, that to me that diagram starts to speak about could have been really played up in the way the partie evolved. And that life and a lot of what I think that you started off about, talking about at the beginning of the presentation could have really pushed it even further architecturally, like connecting the idea with the architectural idea.
I think one thing I didn't appreciate initially was the sectional difference between the new community center in your building. Was there an opportunity for you to start down lower by grade?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if there's like, also just in terms of accessibility for like kids and people who are walking into a center, like there's a lot of gear and strollers and crap you have to carry around. I'm just wondering in terms of sort of like that accessibility and also sort of the, not just the physical accessibility, but also sort of mentally how accessible a space like this, being so high up on the plateau, would feel. But there are some potential missed opportunities by not maybe using that level difference. You know, some kids need more light than other kids, especially those who are younger who who need less light because they're sleeping a lot more. And so I think maybe just a more nuanced sort of consideration of different age categories, because right now it's like the infants can be in the same. You could basically flip flop the rooms effectively, and so there could potentially be some interesting opportunities to think more sectionally.
I have some familiarity with site, um, more than I sweated this one a lot. But it makes me wonder whether you ever looked at a scheme that was parallel to the South Service Court. Was that mentioned? You all mentioned that? The reason I ask that, instead of it being parallel to First Street like that, is because that blank space in the middle between the community center and your project is a playground. And it just makes me wonder whether it might have been possible to maybe use the playground and use the access provided by the service court to continue the line of the site. This is a pathway that unites the lower level park and the upper level park. And if you just kept that as a kind of line, you take this whole thing and turn it here, and then part of the program that might relate to the playground would be facing it there, which to me would make some sense. And you could use these access points, and it would maintain the continuity of that space, which, you know, if we were the Historic Preservation Review Board, one of the things that they might say to you is the continuity from this side to that side would be important as a characteristic, because that is one of the defining aspects of the landmark, right? And you have to kind of deal with the defining aspects of the landmark in terms of and this thing's it's going to open, the first phase where you're proposing is going to open in June, but it would help to kind of make those kinds of determinations about what is the thing in terms of its fundamental characteristics, and how does what I'm doing support that, even though I'm putting buildings where there never were any buildings before. And, you know, I think it would probably go a long way to kind of making a series of buildings along that edge, which would be your building plus the community center, that would then shape a space around the playground, you know, which I think would make, which would be kind of a nice move there to kind of bracket the playground on either side, because the community center has doors that open onto the playground and things like that. And it just sort of makes, it would make a kind of completion of that particular thing. And you still could, you know, you probably could take the whole parking lower level and just turn it 90 degrees and push it closer to the South Service Court, and it would probably fit just fine there. And I think it would be a stronger scheme as a result. It would go with the DNA of the site, perhaps a little bit more than I think what you're proposing. I have a microphone here. I'm interested in it.
I think going along with the comment about, you know, maybe there were diagrams that just didn't make it on the board, and, you know, making sure that they get into your portfolio. So much of this project is about that corridor, diagramming the activities that are going through and are off that corridor. But also a lot of this project is site driven, and kind of piggybacking off of the comment about the play yards and seeming undersized. I think if you diagram more than just kind of the carved space available for the play, but the types of play that you could have there might help. There's code and like the minimum, and I think your instincts were right that it just wasn't enough. But then I think once you actually start to think about the program and how the space is used, you might find out, gee, you need like a lot more. And you're not quite at this stage, but as you develop as a professional and you realize like, gee, I really do need to put all that dang furniture and equipment into the room. Like think about that as you're doing like a specialty space. This is, very specific to early childhood education. And I think that will help you understand how to really flesh out the program. So you can think about more than the swing. There's going to be the sandbox. There might be like the wobble things, and just looking at playground equipment and realizing like the variety of the outdoor play that can happen, I think will help you. And whatever you do from this point forward, really digging into the program and understanding the requirements, I think will help develop your projects a lot.
The point that you just made about furniture, I think, can't be understated. I mean, the reality is this thesis is about childhood development, and not to say that the architecture doesn't matter. I mean, we could argue about flat roofs versus pitched roofs all day, but ultimately, what matters for a project like this is how the children are engaging within the spaces. And I do think it would have been nice to see sort of at least more of what's shown of how each of these spaces would be utilized by children. How where can they break out into these little nooks? Where they have these opportunity to look out into the play area, into the courtyard? Where can they look back into the corridor and see the other kids running past that? And not just through. I think that can happen both through the architecture as well as through how these spaces are utilized and seeing what actually occurs.
And just to add to that, I think one thing that I'm noticing that's maybe missing here is like how the space would actually look by way of color. Like I feel like early childhood education centers and elementary schools are really colorful environments, and sometimes it could look almost chaotic or haphazard, and I almost feel like there could be a design project in itself of like how do you design for the chaos of like all the little footprint art and the handprints and the clay things, and like there's not a lot of open wall space for that from what I can tell, but being playful in sort of imagining sort of that livelihood coming to the space itself.
Any other comments? Okay. Well, Maggie, it's been wonderful to work with you. Whether it was undergrad online studio during COVID, or as the Keibel Gallery GA installing shows, and through thesis, I think you have a great ability to work with complexity and to make sort of simple things out of complex systems. I think we're seeing that here where you've been taking in a lot of complex information like America's childcare crisis, or code and regulations, or this site, which you know very well, and many people here know very well, which is really complex, especially sectionally, but not to mention in terms of kind of the site constraints, even in plan. And I think what you're hearing is that people want to be let into some of that complexity that you know is there, and that they and we know is there, and that you've presented a kind of succinct solution, which doesn't give maybe full depth to the complexity that you've baked in here. So I think the feedback about like, but let us see the diagrams and let us see the kind of section at a bigger scale, is a good reminder to not only take all this information in and create simple solutions and simple drawings that communicate clearly, but also kind of embrace that complexity and bring it forward, so that we can all go on the whole journey with you, not just kind of see the final product. So congratulations, and thanks for taking me on this educational journey with you.
Thank you.
So folks, now we're going to pick our chairs up and rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise, and we'll face the south wall. Give us a couple seconds to get set up. Chill, Kevin. Okay, so our next contestant, Kevin Hernandez, his thesis, and the thesis we'll see right after that, focus on a portion of Washington, D.C. that many of us have passed through, but probably don't know much about. And hopefully this will give us a new opportunity to rethink our relationship to that part of the city. So Kevin's committee was Juan Burke, myself, and who are we pointing at? Oh, Michael Abrams. And it's all yours. Enjoy.
Hello. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Hernandez, and I'm happy to present to you Eduscape, crafting social landscapes through learning within Washington, D.C., and more specifically, Ivy City and Trinidad. The design strategy for this project and for this thesis was to provide the community with sort of as much respect and care as they sort of deserve, and that's looking at it through three main avenues. The first one is to provide amenities, mainly through the use of a public library system, specifically how libraries nowadays are providing much more than a place just to check out books, but more of a place to sort of do a lot of things, whether it's like look for jobs or use the internet, sort of a multi-purpose function there. Another is to provide educational opportunities, and that's looking through providing and designing a vocational/trade school within the location. On the site, as I'll go into a little bit later, there's already an existing vocational/trade school for high schoolers, but it's in a really bad shape, and so giving them a place to sort of exist and to sort of be respected is sort of the goal with that. And the last one is to foster community through social spaces, more specifically public green spaces, with connecting the existing site with amenities that are already existent. So why specifically Ivy City and Trinidad? These are both communities in Washington, D.C. in Ward 5. As Professor Kelly was saying earlier, we drive past a lot, specifically on York Avenue as well as West Virginia Avenue. And both communities were established around the same time in the late 1800s, with Ivy City specifically sort of getting a boom in the early 1900s due to the rail yard being constructed. But along the mid 1900s, both sort of, or more specifically Ivy City, the sort of economics in the community kind of fell into the decline, with a lot of the sort of social services in the city sort of beginning to act as if the city was ignored and sort of forgot about it. We're talking about sort of like no trash pickup, sort of drugs and sort of needles on the ground, just not really a place where people would want to be specifically. However, in recent years, due to the popularity of areas such as the Union Market and sort of the revitalization of the Hecht Warehouse, which was in Ivy City, now converted into sort of luxury apartments, Ivy City, and more specifically New York Avenue in Washington, D.C., have gotten a lot of sort of attention for commercial development. And we can see here one of those being New City, DC, which is at the top or tip of the Ivy City. And we can start to see here the sort of enormous sort of build kind of overarching the existing community themselves. And even the city of Washington, D.C. had begun to sort of look into this, specifically through this New York Avenue roadmap, finding ways how to sort of take New York Avenue and sort of begin to sparse how areas like this would be used in the near future. And we can even though sort of these economic opportunities are bringing life into Ivy City, a lot of these spaces are mostly sort of foods or sort of bars, sort of a more commercial type of idea and identity rather than sort of building something for the community themselves. And this is even sort of seen in a lot of news articles, and specifically sort of outreach of a lot of residents wanting to sort of be heard, a lot of them not wanting, another bar or another cafe, wanting something built for the community themselves. Most specifically, like people wanting and kids wanting a place to play, given that the current existing infrastructure is just not there for them. And it even got to the point where Ivy City and Trinidad built their own sort of initiative, and this is looking at requesting improved access to affordable housing, but also looking into other elements such as green, sustainable development, sort of a shared social and economic prosperity, walkable communities, and just sort of social spaces for them to inhabit. And more specifically, going into why a library. As mentioned earlier, libraries are becoming more multifunctional. In one example, they're holding events for the elderly, while as most recently in the pandemic, they become a beacon of hope and in the small communities offering areas for vaccines or protection. And it becomes a little bit more clear why a library, why a type of programming that builds on sort of social cohesion is more important, given that on the current existing site, most of the area is residential with small spurts of sort of commercial development, a little bit more closer to Ivy City. But as we begin to sort of look into a little bit deeper, both communities are sort of filled and ample, have a variety of educational institutions, all from the lowest level from K all the way to university level, specifically with Gallaudet University. But there's also KIPP DC Academy, which is a K through 12 school. And also, as mentioned earlier, a New Beginnings Vocational School, which again is at a really poor, dilapidated state. But then going into a little bit more, it's like why the library would make sense in this location. The DC public library system is pretty good, I would argue, and it boasts 27 neighborhood libraries. However, only 2 wards have 1 or less libraries, and one of those are in Ward 5, which is where Ivy City and Trinidad are located. Which is more important given that in Washington, D.C., about 90 to 95% of the population live within 1 mile of a library. However, in our existing site in Ivy City, the nearest library is 1.5 miles away, over a 30-minute walk, which would have residents, children having to cross New York Avenue, which isn't something they would want to do. So going into more specifically on the site selection, one of the master plans or developments that have been proposed on the site is this campus from the West Virginia Avenue Public Works, more specifically the Department of Public Works building. There's already an existing site in Ivy City, which sort of is used for sort of vehicle maintenance. However, this master plan sought to sort of bring a lot of their offices to the space and sort of create a more educative type of hub. And so quickly going over how the current existing sort of site looks with the Department of Public Works facility all the way towards the rear. With their new Department of Public Works plan, it sort of takes on a lot of the vacant space that's currently existing. However, they left a small sort of sliver or block on the edge of Mount Olivet and West Virginia Avenue, which at the current moment are existing just vacant sort of car lots, things of that nature. So this provides an ample opportunity to utilize this part of the site, not only to connect back to the Department of Public Works facility in order to create a holistic campus along West Virginia Avenue, but also ties in all sort of three neighborhoods in that corner of the Gallaudet University community, Trinidad, as well as Ivy City. And more specifically, at this corner, it becomes apparent that one of the sort of main routes, Central Place Road, which links all the way back through the heart of Ivy City, but more specifically to the old historic Cromwell School on the site. And the other road on Montello Avenue going south, again, connects us back to the heart of the Trinidad community itself. And so with the location set in place, we wanted to sort of look into sort of the considerations on the site that began to affect how the project will begin to sort of build form. One of the biggest considerations is sort of this corner condition, again, being at West Virginia Avenue and Mount Olivet Street, Mount Olivet Road, sort of gives prominence to this corner. The second is utilizing the blocks as an organizing feature, given that the streets are at a weird angle, there's not much regulation there, using the surrounding context to begin to regulate and begin to sort of organize the space became apparent. And lastly, one is providing or looking at opportunities for a green avenue or boulevard from the existing park, which at the moment isn't really being used, all the way through a potential opening at the Mount Olivet Cemetery, which already has several walking paths ample for biking and things of that nature. So going into how the space becomes utilized, so having, again, the Department of Public Works facility as sort of a basis on the back, wanted to look into how the site would be used, and given that there would be two sort of main programs of the project, one being the library and one the vocational school, is looking into how the mass will begin to form on this site, and as they begin to connect and float upwards, but being a connecting feature, we begin to see and find the opportunities to create a holistic project and sort of site entirely within the space. And so begin to sort of look into how both buildings can begin to sort of not only coordinate within one another of having a library and a vocational school, but also beginning to sort of design how the space will be used for the public as well. So beginning into the design of sort of the ground floor and the first floor, again, a large part of the project was finding ways how to sort of not only connect both buildings together, but also find a way to connect the site with it as well. And so utilizing both masses to create this form of using a spine in between both of them to not only become a separator between the courtyard in the front, but a plaza in the back, but also begins to sort of connect both buildings together. And the same is seen on the second floor, which becomes more specialized in the programming on its own as well. So looking into how, again, the sort of design of the buildings begins to be formed through the site. So again, the angled corners began to give an idea of how the spaces on the ground floor will begin to sort of reflect, and that is done on both buildings as well. But another key component of the design was the design of a core. And in each building, the main core, or there's a core in each building that begins to sort of regulate the type of program that's within it. So for example, in the library, on the second floor, this core becomes independent study rooms where people can either come in to sort of use the space or sort of navigate around it. And in the vocational school, given it's more of a cellular type structure, with sort of a core in the middle with classrooms on the edge, it gives us an opportunity for students and visitors to sort of experience the entirety of the project. And while the spine itself isn't wide or has enough of a volume to sort of have its own piece, it becomes its own core and beginning to separate the functions of both parts of the project with the public or with the more private courtyard of the residents towards the south, but then the public plaza opportunity in the rear as well. And with all these sort of conditions beginning to sort of affect how and where the programs of the spaces will become. So for the design of the library, of course, the main entryway, sort of you're greeted into this wide open space, which begins to allow and point visitors to one end of the building to another, whether access to the upper story, to the children's area towards the rear, or towards the spine in order to reach the public vocational school. And this is one view of the examples of how the core on the second floor begins to react. Again, it both creates sort of spaces for people and visitors to come access them, but also provides passageways for visitors, readers, and anyone alike to be able to use the space as well. The design of the trade school also begins to do something similar, which we can see here in more detail how the core begins to organize some of the cellular spaces along the edges. But this sort of view, allowing visitors to sort of, again, to be able to pick out the direction in which they'll be able to go or to see, becomes how this becomes to be organized. And secondly, given that the design of the trade school is sort of used for vocations and things of that nature, the design is so that at the ground floor, there are heavier sort of machinery or larger space classrooms in order to sort of access the function of those spaces as well. But we can see here the sort of spaces such as an auditorium and the major classrooms and the conference rooms in the trade school are able to sort of access and sort of provide a lot of that programmatic necessity for visitors of that site, while also allowing opportunities to sort of, again, reach back to the spine and to the exterior of the project as well. And then looking specifically into the spine as well, this sort of becomes the connecting feature on the second floor, a bit of a sky bridge. But in this case, the spine can help drive the visitor all the way towards the end of the vocational school in distances, but it also allows them to get a view of what sort of the space the spine itself is allowing to create for visitors alike. And here as well is another view of the central courtyard itself. We begin to see how the space becomes manicured by both buildings, but also how it begins to also provide a space for the residents and visitors alike, as well as the children's park and play area adjoined to the children's section of the building itself, but also sort of allowing and guiding visitors from this main street all the way from this own residential portion into the building and into further into the spaces along the back as well. And then finally, this view here is also representing that similar idea of how these spaces can begin to not only provide a space for the residents themselves to visit and to see, but also a place for them to experience as well. Given that, again, the site of Ivy City and Trinidad are sort of both communities in need of a social and central hub, the necessity of having something of that nature for them to sort of be able to access is something that has been imperative in the design itself. And given that the program of a library and the vocational school isn't something that we typically are seeing in the United States, especially in these locations as well, it's something that hopefully we can begin to start to see more of and have our cities and planners begin to sort of implement these designs more into our neighborhoods themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And now the crit device. There we go.
Sorry, I just have to leave in a few minutes, but I know this neighborhood quite well because I live in Trinidad. And one of the things, I have two comments basically. The first is really about sort of the social good that you're providing to this neighborhood, which I think is abundant and really like applause-worthy. But I'm wondering if you considered at all service provision beyond just sort of the benefit of having a vocational school and the library, in which you're starting to see more models of libraries offering social workers and other sorts of social services within their footprint. This neighborhood, I'm sure you've done a site visit or two, like has a lot of issues regarding substance use disorders as well as sex trafficking. And so it might be a really great opportunity to kind of use the footprint of your library or your educational space to offer those services that would really benefit the community members who are really are having a really difficult time with those concerns. And then just my other comment is a little bit about the sort of orientation of your spine. Urbanistically, it feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity, and I'm just curious as to why you located it, you know, 1/4 into your, or 1/4 from the northern end of your site versus perhaps using the corner or like having a space that's more prominently related to sort of the street condition. It seems like it's not hitting the park entrance on either side. It seems like it's kind of neither here nor there. So I was wondering why that particular placement.
Yeah, the sort of selection of where the spine is chosen initially and for the most part was wanted to be pulled back in order to be sort of hugging and inviting towards the residents of Trinidad themselves through that main street. And given that the process of the design of the building was looking into utilizing the Department of Public Works master plan of having sort of their station built behind it was to sort of create this thinner avenue towards the back. And so on one end is to sort of create this sort of hugging pocket for visitors or for mostly for residents themselves, given that they're the ones in more need of a sort of green, sort of publicly available space. So that's why it's not necessarily closer to the street condition in this case.
Any thoughts on service provision?
The one of the biggest things for the library, especially on the ground floor, was to sort of allow for a lot of open and flexible spacing. There's sort of the design was to allow for 2 larger conference rooms on the ground floor. Obviously, the conference room isn't necessarily evocative of a sort of a healthy come get taken sort of have services given to you type of way. But the idea is that a lot of these spaces, especially on sort of the more publicly available floors or areas, are sort of open to that flex space. So that's sort of the idea with having that there.
Yeah, I would love to get further into the sort of social services side that this could potentially have to offer. As we move into the future, the traditional purpose of libraries obviously are becoming obsolete, but a lot of neighborhoods are really utilizing those spaces as for much more flexible purposes, whether they be for social services, for different types of gatherings, and how they're actually much more utilized 24/7 than they ever had been previously. So I think that's great. I would love to hear a lot more about what sorts of other services this can provide, how the spaces can be made to be flexible as needs change. So you aren't so internally, you're not so locked down into any one particular architecture. They can sort of mold and shift as the needs of the neighborhood change. I think formally, in terms of how this is all laid out, I could absolutely buy into sort of your corridor that you have sort of coming up on edge, approaching the entry that way. I would almost like to see your sort of entry moment here almost rise above everything else to really sort of mark that area. I think that's great for the library side. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about whether or not why that same approach or a similar idea wasn't approached for the trade school side of things. It seems to be more just sort of like plopped right in dead center. And then again, reflecting on your comments about sort of the spine, could there have been an opportunity to push that, maybe one major bay forward, make it more prominent from the neighborhood side, maybe even programming that spine as you cross from the library over to the trade school. So as opposed to just having this glass walled corridor, you actually have some breakout spaces and smaller flex spaces that sort of dive off to either side. And you can actually take advantage of some of those views that it has to offer.
Mm-hmm.
First, congratulations on reaching this milestone. I'm sure you're feeling a lot of relief and also trepidation at our comments. Going along with the spine, I feel like this is actually 2 buildings trying to be one. Usually, because the owner of the vocational school and the library would probably be different. And so I don't see like a door closing off the vocational school. And I'm questioning whether there could be more porosity on the first floor between all of the green space in the front and this plaza that isn't really developed in the rear yet. And so the other thing that I'm wondering, going along with like the purposes of a library are changing so much right now, is a vocational school, the students may not actually be in a lecture hall. They may spend all of their time in their vocational shops. And so I'm wondering if there was an opportunity to move the auditorium closer to the library on the other side so that it could be co-programmed as a community space where they have any kind of informational sessions, workshops for the community that, just think a little bit more deeply about how people are going to use the space and how the 2 spaces can be a little bit more related to each other besides the thin spine. I think some of the ideas of like maybe there's some of these offices or breakout rooms coming off of the spine is a wonderful one. But just think about, can the two spaces be a little bit more related to each other?
You know, to pick up on what was just said, is it's almost like you haven't decided if this is a courtyard scheme or if it's object building. And to me, it's almost like maybe it should have been two bars, maybe pulled apart a little bit more, but then really clearly define the courtyard and be able to spill out into the courtyard, really use it. You know, so that the rooms that are there could have walls that open up, and then it would help with just the overall security also that would be inherent in the architecture composed that way. You know, people couldn't just walk into the courtyard. You have to go through the building through some process. And so that's what I see, you know, here. It's sort of somewhere in between. So is there a reason why? And, you know, part of it has a courtyard, and then it opens up to a big field or whatever.
Right. So that sort of core in between both buildings was sort of more meant to, one, be a green space, but that also helps sort of regulate a bit of circulation and traffic, especially with
The space in the middle?
in the middle between the both buildings, yeah. Given the sort of pathways and how it begins to sort of, at least it's organized through the hardscape, was trying to sort of build a way to sort of allow people to, if they didn't want to say necessarily go through or connect through the spine, they want to go through the middle portion of the library out into the open space. It sort of give that passageway to allow them to do so.
But imagine that, you know, you have the sort of covered walkway on the west side. What if that was on the first building? If that were on the east side, and then you also have some covered walkway at the ground floor in the second building. And if those two covered areas would be really, you know, nice to sort of then from the inside of the building, you open out to that, and then from there you go into the courtyard. So you're somewhere in between.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. On the vocational school side, there is sort of a very small bay that has that little bit where it's sort of a covered sort of overhang, and that is to sort of allow that sort of balance between wanting to be sort of inside a space, but also have that visual connection outside, sort of allowing that to sort of carry through to multiple sides of the building. I can see how it could for sure sort of build a more connection that becomes sort of a transfer between one zone to the other.
But see up here in that rendering in the middle, if you imagine you have that and it extends further, but you had it on the other side also. It would just be, I think, it then would make that courtyard more interesting and composed instead of just leftover space. Because right now it's like, well, that building on the right could move further that way, or the building on the left, and it doesn't, you know, do anything. So it's just my take on it.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I go by this area often, and I know there's that corner in particular could use, some some help. I think the programming is really critical, just like others have mentioned. I think you can, with the amount of space that you're utilizing, you can probably fit a lot of programming because of just, it's kind of a small area that you're serving, right? So Ivy City, in terms of like the actual residential density, it's actually quite small.
The community itself.
Yeah, the community itself. And I think what's interesting about it is that there's a lot of, or former light industry and heavy industry in some areas. There's a lot of mechanic shops. Right now, there are a lot of distilleries and breweries and restaurants, like you mentioned earlier, that they kind of need different programming. One thing that I really like about the MLK library is that they host a lot of community organizing. So I see use for the conference spaces and like the lecture theater being a lot more of a public amenity there. And I think the community would really appreciate that. One thing that I had a question about was how you picked sort of the facade type, and I feel that a lot of the design was focused on volume and massing, but how did you determine, I think it's metal cladding or rain screen?
Yeah, so that went back and forth a lot on wanting to sort of either, given that, like you were mentioning, the sort of connection to Ivy City is one where sort of in terms of density population is relatively small. However, so the thought was whether or not have the sort of design of the facades and those materials be more akin to what's already traditionally there. So whether that becomes something that's more like maybe brick, because there's a lot of that there, both in Trinidad and in Ivy City. But ultimately, the decision was to sort of go with something that has it stand out a little bit more, honestly. Not only at the corner of West Virginia and Mount Olivet, specifically with sort of the orange cladding for the library, but wanting to sort of have a distinct difference between both the vocational school and the library was something that I wanted to make quite apparent. So that's sort of where the decision making on that front came along.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a good location for that sort of contrast and exploration, something more contemporary in terms of finish, because they have quite a variety of buildings because there are a lot of these sort of warehouses. I had another question about just the trades, the vocational school. I noticed that there are a lot of tables in these large rooms. They don't really look like there's a lot of workspace or, I mean, it looks flexible enough, but I was thinking it could have really benefited from maybe roll-up doors and loading and a little more infrastructure to give it a more, I guess it would differentiate that space from the rest of the building, and also loading is a big component. So I think, is that a parking lot at the back, or what's that square?
That square, yeah, it's meant as a sort of parking, like on-site parking for visitors of sort of the school or not. The idea is also that the sort of pullback road across the Mount Olivet Cemetery that eventually leads back to the Department of Public Works could be a space where maybe some drop-off happens as well towards the rear area of the vocational school. So having those shutter doors or more of a sort of heavy type of language, both in architecture and in feel, I think would definitely make those spaces stand out a lot more.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I think the thing about an object building or not is a really important issue because there's a suburban quality to this that I think density and trying to get this to be tighter would give it more intensity as a place. So, and then just the other part about it is one thing I've appreciated about coming here to DC is that the library program is actually quite wonderful. And libraries are some of our important public spaces and buildings. And giving the library some degree of architectural prominence here, where this might be more of a head-tail scheme where the corner is more articulated and that building is, you know, the dominant social place with a courtyard that may come along. I'm sorry, what's the name of the street? Mount Olive?
Mount Olivet,
Yes. Yeah, comes along there, that perhaps the corner might be more articulated and less of a kind of resultant of geometry, but had some degree of intensity. And I'm wondering whether or not, you know, the sort of entrance to this is way back here or it's way back there and could have, sorry about that. Got to hold this here for 1 second. Whether or not this could have had a loggia coming across here to enter into a primary entrance that then may have a loggia along here that could be around here. So everything was kind of focused around the intensity of what this court is. Take this parking and perhaps create a new street where you could do parking and drop off to come feed it here, but make that a really amazing green space that, you know, if I look here, for me, the sort of figure ground is reversed in terms of what's paved versus what's green. And one of the benefits would be to have a really wonderful green space that may end up having something that's an event thing, but it's dominant. And this, to me, feels like it's kind of backyard in your front yard. You know, as a childhood place, it might be something that may be better contained here. as a kind of thing that then puts this as a major public space, which this future development, if it had another address off this, they could all architecturally be part of this primary court, which could be a benefit to the community in a more, intensive way.
Hi, Kevin.
Yo.
It's a very admirable program here. Certainly Ivy City is a really interesting and kind of forgotten place, and your attention there is warranted, I think, in terms of all that. I think one of the big questions here is, where's the front? Is it on Mount Olivet or West Virginia? Or even, I was looking at, is it Montello, which is the street that's almost opposite the courtyard there? And this kind of series of decisions you made, I think Craig was talking a little bit where the front door goes. And I end up wondering about whether West Virginia is the right place for it, or even Mount Olivet, that it seems like if Ivy City is that city on your site plan down to the bottom part, you could almost say, well, Montello as a city that ends in the courtyard, as a kind of spine street for that neighborhood, would make some sense. I guess to me as well, it's kind of a campus planning kind of problem, even though it's a small campus. And the drawing that's missing for me is kind of a Noli plan, where I can see the relationship of interior spaces to exterior, and your perspectives start to do some of that, and to the extent to which they do that well, they do it very well, like this one here. But it would help clarify the plan order to make a drawing where you could see, well, where are the major lobbies and gathering spaces inside these buildings, and how do they relate to the exterior spaces? Because I'm caught between a kind of wanting to see the buildings define the outdoor spaces more aggressively and more emphatically, and then also trying to make, Michael was saying, well, make the buildings 2 bars, trying to also have a simple program that could, on a site like this, it might make some sense. So I find myself caught between wanting the buildings to maybe not be so simple, and maybe define these urban spaces a little bit more, and then I could begin to see how all this comes together. As far as the bridge connection is concerned, I'd be happy if it was just at the 2nd floor, and then you could walk through the ground floor, so you could have the continuity of public space in and around it. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think the other way you could look at this is, one of the things DC libraries do is they customize their programs, I could even see it being maybe one building. I can understand why you connected them, because in a lot of communities, because they don't have this, they add that to the library program, because they don't have classrooms. And some of the libraries in DC have more classroom space and meeting space than others, because there's not a community center nearby and things like that, and they adapt those programs that way. And so you could almost argue that there would be another reason why this might even be a more contiguous building, that those kind of program elements would all have something to do with one another. But I think when you think about going back and making this for your portfolio, you really ought to make a kind of Noli plan, so you can see the hierarchy of the lobbies and the interior spaces relative to the exterior spaces. I had to get really close to the drawings to understand that, and that's a diagram that I think would help clarify a lot of those things.
I think the one thing that I wish you would have done more of is actually made more building. Like, I feel like either the building there needs to be more presence of the building, or there needs to be more identified as like future development sites, because the site's really big for what you've given us as a building. And, I think maybe to somebody else's comment about the trade school is that I think you could have really gone even further in on that and thought about the trade school as like also incubator space, where they learn a trade, maybe then it then turns into a small shop and small business. The outdoor space, I think some people have hit upon this, but to me, you almost have a street in between the building, your building, and then the building that's to the north of it. And I wish there was more development to that. And thinking about like, for the trades, there's probably outdoor yards, that you could have focused on too, is like, what's an outdoor training setting that this building could have begun to create. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, I know that across the street on the Plant South side, you have some commercial. You know, there's like storefront there walking. I think you could sort of, you know, play off that typology as well, and in the master plan, kind of add that as like he mentioned, future developments would probably benefit from maintaining that street face as a commercial. Yeah, just another thought.
What did you anticipate the future development to be?
So I saw it either going in two ways. One thought was that it would be a continuation of the program was being proposed. So obviously, given the library takes its own front, mainly on West Virginia Avenue, but the idea that the trade school could develop into, say, another building or sort of provide a different type of program that can either be distinct from the other two buildings or can work in cohesion with the other two. Another thought of it was being sort of converted into either house more affordable housing on the area. There's already a few spots between Ivy City and Trinidad that are beginning to sort of be slightly developed, but I think it's an opportunity if sort of the residents have what they sort of want and need, what they've been crying out for, sort of more affordable and better housing in the area. That'd be one opportunity for them to sort of have that spot there and be adjacent to public programming that can not only satisfy their needs through housing, but also have a space where they could feel welcomed, being either in the trade school or the library. It also can be another opportunity for them to have a connection with the already existing green space of the cemetery on its side. Obviously, the cemetery might not be the first thought of a sort of happy, accessible green space that people or residents may have, but the cemetery is also sort of, again, like paid very well for biking or for walking, and there's ample opportunity for people to sort of visit and utilize that space. And I don't think that spaces like these are talked about enough. The National Arboretum is even to the further east to the space, but getting there is kind of a pain in the butt to get there if you don't have a car, can sort of zip around. So having the residents be able to sort of have their space through sort of the courtyard in between both buildings, but also having that sort of pathway and green avenue into the cemetery was sort of one way that they could utilize that space if they were to get housing in that future development spot.
What other strategies did you look at as a sort of beginning series of parties for the site other than this?
Initially, the goal was to take the site a little bit further north of where it was existing, where the current Department of Public Works facility currently stands. And that was also sort of taking a similar action of utilizing some of the existing streets and sort of block systems to begin to organize some of the massings. But in terms of Part T, the initial idea was to have two separate buildings. I know some of the comments were about how the programming can become unified, or one specific program of one building could be a bit more amplified. But the idea was to have two distinct spaces, given that sort of the area is there for it to happen, and it would just allow for an opportunity for each building to thrive on their own.
Yeah, I think just we're seeing the final product, and that the evolution of how you went about it and the different strategies you employed are also helpful to understand how you got to where you arrived. The other thing I think for me, just commentary wise, is the lack of models, and having a physical model to see is something that is always helpful. And did you build models of this as you were going through this, or did you do it all virtually?
Physical, no, it was all virtual.
Thanks. Thank you for this proposal. Just very quickly, I think that the library is such a fabulous kind of centerpiece of the neighborhood. And looking at the neighborhood plan, there's this long driving axis. And I imagine that the kids, grown-ups on weekends, older people, would find this as a neighborhood collector and they would process up here. And so it seems like a real opportunity to make that iconic statement that I think Craig was making earlier. So, you know, having a kind of front door to that public living room for the neighborhood would be kind of fantastic. So that would lead you to extend the building and make a major crosswalk here instead of a couple of other crosswalks. The other thing I observed is that you seem to have two different attitudes about the relationship to the street. One is, you know, hugging pretty tight to the street, and the other is to make a very suburban sort of relationship. And I wonder if it would make sense to bring everything to the street, but then kind of step down in scale so that you were making a gesture to the neighborhood and then increasing in scale as you get to the large scale of the buildings beyond and, you know, the large scale of the cemetery and that kind of park-like space. And then the other thing is you've got this lovely opportunity for a progression from the city to the city of the dead or the country. And just one final thought, this green space across the street with that arc, it seems like a geometry that you might want to play with as you're moving into your site. So, you know, I think this is a lovely project for the neighborhood, and I can imagine having even more fun with it as you go forward.
I'm piggybacking off of Madeline's comments. I think what we're looking for maybe are some street sections along here. Like you have this wonderful building section where you're showing this relationship through here, but you have this like very residential scale street here. I think this is some of that commercial or maybe there's some parking in the front. And so this sort of prospect of really broad, it might, I think studying how that feels going across the site would have been helpful to you to think about those relationships and looking at some of the other relationships around here. You've got this green space here, so like how is this differentiated from here? I'm not too sure what this is. I'm sure that there's a reason for it. It's just not clear right now. And, you know, or is this scale of green space fronting some of the building more appropriate? I think kind of maybe zooming out and studying all those different things from the neighborhood, or if you did do those analyses, showing it to us so that we could understand how you're responding to the context.
Yeah, I think you had a pretty good challenge here of going from, you know, very small scale residential building to suddenly enormous industrial warehouse type thing. So I appreciate your efforts to, you know, sort of look at breaking down the scale and sort of make that transition on the site and what essentially is a very small area to do so. I think going back to, I believe it was Matt's comment of, you know, making it more of a campus planning type study and, you know, not being afraid to broaden the borders of what you're looking at, you know, expanding that scope. I mean, this is the beauty of it all, you know, being a design project is we're not in the real world yet, so we can do whatever we want. And so, you know, looking at like, I appreciate these diagrams. I would like to see these sort of maybe 5 times the size that they are up here. There's been a lot of talk about, you know, this street, I forget the name, as potentially being that pedestrian scale type axis that could be really important because, I mean, our cities are unfortunately so car dependent. It's nice to have that relief to be able to use at, you know, the walking scale or the biking scale and have that sort of be the entry. And I think this was almost beginning to allude to that up here. And then again, with this sort of greenway that you could potentially have coming across, I would have liked to see sectionally how that could happen. You know, if this is pinched in and you have sort of, you know, that public green space, does the building form the walls for that? What's a nice scale for someone to be experiencing this where you have the enclosure of the building walls, but it's not too oppressive. You know, you get that nice sort of plaza type scale. Forget these surface parking lots. What happens if someone comes back in and you make this wonderful green space, you're able to, someone comes back in, develops this, and then all of a sudden you have two faces to it. Things like that, I think, would be interesting to explore further.
I think where we're going to is maybe sound a little old-fashioned, but you should have had a model, physical model. All of these things we're talking about would have been easy for you to see. And you could have had the different massing diagrams in relationship to, you know, what exists there. Right. And it just would have been very helpful. You've been making pretty much images and not volumes per se. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. If you schlepped this project down to the deputy mayor's office in DC and said, give us some money to support this, they would turn around to you and they would say, okay, we're interested, right? But what do we get out of it? We need housing, right? And this would be a perfect 4/2 or 5/2 project where you could have 2 levels of concrete podium, have public uses in the podium, and do residential above. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, DC is obviously land, you know, fixed. We can't expand horizontally, so we have to figure out clever ways to go up. And somebody said, well, yeah, but look, 5 stories I think would be totally fine in this neighborhood, you know, 5 or 6, what's that? Right. Well, that's in the West End. It's a little bit taller, but I think were you to program this again, you would. And if I was around, I would, you know, advise you to consider something like that, because those are the challenges I think we face, to be able to maximize the use of the land we have to the benefit of most people. And I think you're halfway there with the library and the vocational trade school. But, you know, putting affordable housing on top of that, I think would be kind of a no-brainer, because the city needs it. This would probably be 2 stories of concrete. We know how to do that, and we know how to put wood on top of concrete. And, you know, I think it would lend a kind of density there. And so the buildings across the street are 1, 2, 3 stories, but a 4 or 5, to me, even a 6-story building, if it's done well and it's not this massive wall, could fit in very well there. And I could easily see a project like this evolving towards that. And, you know, if I was one of the people in the deputy mayor's office, I would say to you, that's all fine what you've done, but let's triple the density and see what we can get, see how we could make that work.
Yeah. Okay, Kevin. So the day finally came, and just looking back at the semester, Kevin was my TA in 654 urban history course. And so we had this nice routine where, you know, I would teach and then we'd have coffee and talk about his thesis. It became a little nice routine. So I'm gonna miss that. And yeah, thank you for the semester, Kevin. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate many of the things that were said. Many of the comments that were brought up were things that we discussed. The flexibility of the library. The site is difficult, which I think is what produced this conversation. Yeah, when people were talking about the flexibility of libraries today, I was like, Kevin, tell them that, you know, we talked about that it's in there. And so, and similar with other things. It makes me think about some of the things we've seen today, some of the projects, and what gets poured in the final product of a thesis project, and what doesn't, what is visible, and what isn't, because Kevin was very productive, very hardworking student, and every revision we had, he would bring dozens of sketches. So we thought about everything you said. Kevin made the decisions that he felt were the correct ones. And there's obviously room for improvement and growth. I do agree with some of the things that were mentioned. The model, physical model, that's a good call, and that's very much warranted. So thank you very much, Kevin. Congratulations. It was great working with you.
Thank you all.
We have a few seconds here for a comfort break because we have to turn this partition around. So those of you in the thesis press section that want to help with that, greatly appreciated. And the reviewers are going to need to turn your chairs counterclockwise, 90 degrees, and line up across here for the flight line. Just remembered why we bought this sound system. Professor Bell, do you recall I know Professor Gardner remembers the Latin Mass that Alan Chimikov gave us one time during a thesis review where he was going, we couldn't hear anything, yeah. Okay, so folks, thank you. This has been a great afternoon. Before we get this review up and running, I just want to remind people that tomorrow morning we'll start at 10 a.m., a little bit later, and then we'll do the same thing on Wednesday. I do hope that those of you that have presented today can help tomorrow some of those folks that helped you get things set up and hang around and support your fellow classmates. This is one of the great things. I always love watching the teamwork that goes on here. It really does, even though the theses are individually authored, it really does take a team to get these things done. I also want to thank the reviewers that were here with us today. Usually at the end, things get a little chaotic. I want to thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. On Wednesday at the very end of this for faculty, at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, we will be doing the thesis awards deliberations, and we will do those in person in the conference room upstairs. The doors will be locked at 5:10, so after the doors are locked, no one will be allowed in until there is a pope. Oh, no, wait, that's a different thing. Anyhow, we're staying in Ivy City. Judy Tram has been working with Professor Curry, Professor Howell, and myself, and want you to take over the show right now.
Great, thank you. So let me take you down the street from the previous project. So this thesis is titled Food Service, Cultivating Food Equity and Resilience in the Heart of Ivy City. So food insecurity is a rising issue in the US, and we're seeing trends of more people turning to nonprofits and food aid organizations, which are highly valuable assets to communities everywhere. And they're using these assets to help meet some of their basic food needs. However, at the same time, charity and assistance to this sector has also seen a decrease following the pandemic, and the high demand is straining the system as a whole. So why should we care about the role of nonprofit organizations in our foodscape? Aside from being the first point of contact for emergency food distribution, nonprofits provide a unique perspective where they're working with communities, food channels, and government resources to help tackle the greater issues that are perpetuating food insecurity. And so the current reliance on food aid organizations indicates that there's a growing need for improved food access and equity, especially when the US cultivates more than 40 million acres than it's needed to feed all Americans. So the issue arises in part due to the existing food supply chain, which evolved after the Green Revolution. More people are disconnected from where their food comes from and rely on the American food supply chain. And this already vulnerable chain is, when this chain is disrupted from events like climate-related disasters and pandemics, people turn to nonprofit food aid for more immediate relief and assistance. And so in trying to cultivate an environment that targets food equity and supports the goals of nonprofits while helping alleviate some of their demand, one of the main goals in providing the ability for people and communities to have agency in their foodscape is so that they don't have to rely on this food supply chain. And this can take different forms, such as having direct and physical affordable access to healthier food options, having access to food that can align with health needs, having the knowledge to make personal decisions, and having the financial ability to buy and cook your own meals. And so this thesis starts to investigate how food infrastructure can address food inequity and also shape communities beyond just providing a basic need. So up Central Place from Kevin's project in the heart of Ivy City is where our design intervention takes place. This project is an urban agricultural facility named Ivy City Grows, and it seeks to serve as a third place for the community while also connecting with and distributing to the surrounding area. So as we go through the site analysis and the design proposal, the key themes and design principles are listed here. We are looking to build on the existing resources and community assets, celebrate and preserve the historic legacy of the site and the neighborhood, foster a sense of community ownership, culture, and identity while facilitating place-based learning and skill development, and overall establishing a holistic and resilient localized food system that can engage the residents in the process. So this is Ivy City, and it's located in Washington, D.C., as you know. In gray shows the industrial zoning, and in green shows some of DC's valuable green assets, like the Arboretum, which is nearby. So the site is bounded by New York Avenue, the rail yard, Gallaudet University, and the cemetery. And on the other side of the cemetery is the Arboretum, but it's less than walkable from the site. In addition, there's ongoing development happening to the north and the south of the site, where the Union Market is, and north to the site, on the site where the Hack Warehouse is, which we'll see. And so this threat of development is starting to eat inwards into an already small community. And so there's an opportunity here to utilize the site to establish community ownership and a sense of permanence and stability for the neighborhood. And the site has many assets both inside and outside of its boundaries. Within a mile of the site, there are surrounding parks and recreation spaces, community gardens, and youth centers to connect to. And with Kevin's project, there'll be one more. So let's zoom in to the boundaries of Ivy City. There is a residential neighborhood to the south. It's a small, historically Black neighborhood with a total population of 3,376 people. The census data also shows potential need for food access, for improved food access and affordability. And despite its small population, Ivy City has a very active and vocal community presence, which has advocated for itself time and time again in the face of many threats. And on the other side is the growing mixed-use development. There is a prominence of new food businesses growing over there. So there's a Compass Coffee, a winery, a Mom's Organic Market, and most notably, there's a Union Kitchen food business accelerator, which works with small business owners to grow their brand and business. And this food-centric development can actually provide opportunities that will work with the program and may help the community, may serve the community more in its development. And this is our site that sits at the intersection of these two areas. On the site is the abandoned Crummell School, the former heart of Ivy City's community. It was closed in the 1970s and later abandoned. It received a historic designation in 2002, but still sits on the empty lot, and the community has long advocated for it to be turned into a recreation center with outdoor spaces of at least 1 acre. And the community notes Ivy City's lack of green space as seen here. And so this section shows the site cutting through the residential neighborhood, the school, and its empty lot. And then there's a retaining wall that leads up to a bus depot and then to New York Avenue. So with our design principles in mind, this project looks to restore the Crummell School as a recreation center, creating a promenade from the residential neighborhood to the historic school and extending into a community food production space. The promenade ends in an atrium lobby of the Ivy City Grows Urban Agricultural Facility. So going back to these design principles and starting with building on existing, as we build on the existing, we're trying to support the residential neighborhoods and their connectivity to both the site and the surrounding assets mentioned in the site analysis. We're also looking to celebrate the historic legacy of the site, and one of that entails that the Crummell School is open and restored. It currently sits on this empty lot with a decently new playground and basketball court off to the side, though there's no tree coverage, and it just sits open. And so to celebrate, we start by restoring it, so restoring the building so that it can serve the community again, and then we expand outwards, creating a plaza that can serve as an open event space or a splash pad in the summers. And then looking at how the elevation of the existing building has informed the elevation and facade of the new building, taking some of the cues from the bays and as well as some existing buildings in DC. The bays are divided into 30 feet sections that align with the scale of the residential neighborhood. So looking at the new program for the historic building, it's going to be recreation on the bottom, and the classroom or the former classrooms will be turned into studio spaces. And then at the top level, the walls will open up to create a multi-purpose space. And so at the ground level and the ground level and level 1, the original walls and structure will remain in their original pinwheel layout. And this is an example of how the multi-purpose room might be used by the community. In this perspective, we see a graduation happening, and it serves as a place to celebrate the community. So moving on to food citizenship and taking part in the food process. Outside the school is a community garden, which can be used by residents as well as the residents of neighboring neighborhoods like Trinidad. Plots can also be rented out to nearby businesses, but having the space allows residents to cultivate their own produce and also allows for cultures to be celebrated and shared through produce that might not be able or might not be normally found in traditional American markets. And this is the existing bus lot, and this is where the new food facility would face. And so the facility houses a program that can be used to support, teach, and feed local residents. In the lobby space at the end of the promenade is an open exhibition space. It looks from the lobby, it looks into the industrial usage of the building, such as the vertical farms and processing kitchens on the second floor. And on the upper levels are production and education spaces, which can be used to support volunteers or local residents seeking more skills training. And this is the organization of the second floor and the rooftop production space. And so there's a market located at the corner of the site. It's a small corner market that serves the community and allows them to buy locally and save money. The market is supported by the rooftop beekeeping as well as the vertical farm. So this new proposal considers sustainable strategies for its sunlight and water with its agricultural production. So at the vertical farm level, there are PV panels with glass that face southward, and rainwater and gray water also collected through the building for hydroponic use. And so overall, this building proposal explores how food and food-related infrastructure can serve people beyond their basic needs and bring communities to the forefront of the conversation around food equity. Thank you, and I will open the floor to questions.
And Judy, why don't you come out here too so you can actually talk to your drawings if people have questions, unless you want to scroll back there too. But
Okay.
it was, the laser pointer doesn't really work very well, and I give the implement of critique to whoever wants it. Be shy.
First of all, congratulations. I want to say thanks for the level, and this goes for both you and as well as the previous presenters, for the level of research that you've all done into the work that you did. I appreciate your efforts into looking into preservation and adaptive reuse into this. I think that's really great to see, as well as the inclusion of sustainability elements in terms of how you can use the site's location and all that to its advantages. Looking at using the school, it almost feels like it's sort of the head house into this broader site, and I'm curious to know more about how that existing building sort of interacts with the remainder of the site in terms of, is it anticipated that, there's a lot of traffic passing through it? You sort of mentioned that there's both a ground floor and a first floor. How do they relate to actual grade and where people pass through as they move further back into the production facility? And then sort of how that can serve as the backdrop for this plaza space that you created here.
Yeah, so I'll start with the topography. So there is a pretty heavy change in topography from the residential neighborhoods to New York Avenue. It's about a 16-foot grade change. And through some research, I was also informed that there's development happening along New York Avenue, the corridor as well. So that kind of eats up half of that bus depot, and you can kind of see the development faded out behind the building. And so thinking about how this building can almost serve as a buffer between the residential neighborhood and the traffic and everything happening on New York Avenue was definitely a consideration. And there was also some tricky topography and just like level changes with the building itself, because the building, at least for accessibility, the building, when you enter, you're on a platform and you kind of have to go up or down. And so to kind of navigate through that, on this side, we've excavated below. I'm trying to find a section that might show it better. So here is the stair, but through the excavation and the ramps, people can just enter on the ground level rather than having to use the stairs to navigate that. Can you repeat the second part of your question?
I don't know if I remember what the second part of my question was, to be honest. Just sort of how, I guess, the anticipated uses of the actual plaza space itself, and sort of how each building is able to serve separately as a backdrop for what happens in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I definitely considered the seasonal usage of both the buildings and the way that plants kind of grow, and taken the plaza. You can kind of see in these two perspectives that show the plaza with different uses or functions. So this one's taken during the summer. There's a splash pad with the building in the backdrop. On the other side, there's the plaza being used as a farmer's market. And the building, or at least the newer facility, some of the bays have these garage doors that open and allow the building to kind of navigate between the inside and out. And so those were definitely some things that I took into consideration, and how people use the site is kind of up to them.
To the New York Avenue side, is that proposed? Is that it's all dashed in here?
Yeah. So that was looking at the New York Avenue corridor plan, and so there's no development happening at the moment, but it was looking at some of the information that I found on the maximum like building development for that site. So yeah, so it's kind of like the max of what might be there in the future.
The reason I ask is that it feels like your building totally turns its back on New York Avenue. And where it becomes apparent is in this section. And this, before I say this, your presentation is beautiful. And it's a lot to look at. It's very well crafted. So I totally commend you on it. But what jumps out at me on this section is that the section kind of brings you up this really grand experiential stair in this amazing space, and then it kind of abruptly ends at this wall. And it's a beautiful wall. It's got a nice green vertical garden on it, but to me, it leaves me wanting more. It's like, is it a passageway onto this next building? Is it a way to connect New York and allow your site to really be something that kind of stitches that one really hard edge to the other, to the community that you have on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I actually kind of contemplated over that wall a lot and tried to figure out what might be the best way to end that promenade. I really like that suggestion. I wish I had thought of it earlier.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is like, the one thing that I think is actually really exciting about this long, kind of what I would call the bar building or the main building, is that the top of it is kind of like a sanctuary for growing. It's, it's a place where, you have bees and it looks like greenhouses and all. Because I almost wonder if was there a way to connect that? Because it feels like there's a disconnect between that top and then the two lower levels of the building. I don't see, maybe you can walk us through on plan, like how you might get up there. Is it private? Is it only for the people that work there? Is it the community? Could you explain it a little bit more?
Yeah, so for a while, I was also grappling with what to make private and what to make public. Eventually, I kind of just settled on leaving this double height space open to the community and having the upper two levels be more for production and for people who work there, and to kind of create more of an intentional separation between the two. But it was definitely, the idea was definitely bounced around.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
It's interesting, your program for this, it seems to be all about wellness. You got the physical fitness part, which is for preventive, healthcare. And then you have the, I'm going to say organic food and all of that. And I think maybe just to layer maybe some other sort of social services onto your project probably would have been helpful also. Where you can go, for instance, in the school building, and the community can have legal help there, job training like that one, or maybe he's close enough to you, that's okay, since you seem to follow each other. But I still wonder, what's the space to the north, in front along New York Avenue? What is that? Why are you set back so far from New York Avenue? Yeah, that. What is that?
Oh, that's the,
That's
that's
something else that's planned.
yeah. So that was taking into consideration what might be
Okay.
planned there using the.
Well, maybe that answers what you were asking about, that there's something else planned in front, so it's not addressing New York Avenue, am I right? It's addressing that building that seems to have courtyards. Directly at New York Avenue, yeah? Okay. So it might have been good to sort of show the interaction then, because you slice off and you didn't show what's going to happen there and how your building would relate to that. So, but overall, it's a really interesting project, and 16-foot change in grade, that's like 2 stories. So that's a lot that's got to happen to get you from, what is that, the south to the north. Great work.
Thank you.
I want to commend you for a great presentation showing us the existing conditions in reality so we can kind of put together the picture of what's there and labeling everything in plan so you can read it. We don't have to interpret what that is. So thank you for doing that and doing a lot of nice drawings. I do wholeheartedly agree that the connection to New York Avenue is really important. I think the scale of this facility, especially when you see like the interior image where so the exhibition lobby feels like at a city scale, not at a neighborhood scale. And I think that if you imagine on New York Avenue, which is a major regional artery, that you either you suggested in the massing that there was perhaps a forecourt that, came on access, you could enter it, so it had an address on New York Avenue, not just behind it or having a building that you pass, but some real presence there, I think would give it this kind of community and city connection, which I think this thing would demand just simply by virtue of how much building those big greenhouses are very expensive to operate, and I think they would serve well beyond the community itself. And architecturally, I guess the question of how much does it need to reflect the school or not, or how far do you go? It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts, just why you chose to simply make it, a step, not like a dramatic step, especially with the greenhouses, which can tend to make it a degree of modernity about it, and how that could perhaps influence. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just curious as to how and why you chose it. And then the second issue is what is the Bosca trees here? You didn't really talk about what that is.
So that's a grove, like an edible food grove, and kind of aligns with the community food production
I see.
side of the block.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, you can answer some of the questions.
So your first question was about the architecture of
The language of the,
Yeah, so for the architecture of the facade, I was drawn to both the existing building, which is very evident in the main part of the building, and then I was also looking at some of the more like industrial buildings around DC and the different buildings that have similar like food spaces. So Eastern Market was one. And Union Market, I looked at that nearby. That informed some of like the structural decisions made with like the steel trusses. And so I guess like the decision was to kind of blend in a little bit with the neighborhood.
It's an excellent way. What would have benefit from you saying, look, the typology of this type or the typology is, has this character, and I'm trying to build that up as that's something that you understand from a nature of engaging with those facilities, that is why I chose it, because I'm trying to, build upon that as a typological architectural result. But it would be helpful to see that as a study, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I really like when illustrations or renderings highlight the activities kind of beyond the architecture, and I think you did a good job with that. Even though this is an architecture project, I think it's really about what's going on inside of the spaces. So I appreciate the collages. One question, I'm wondering, you talk about introducing more green space to the neighborhood because there's a lot of paving here. I'm just curious about why you chose to keep a lot of the hardscape. Like in the renderings here, it looks like a lot of hardscape, and even in that orchard, it doesn't look like, it looks like the trees are planted in like planting areas. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question that I also had thought about throughout, and I guess I had originally started with some of like the functions of the spaces first and how the spaces might be used. So there was the existing basketball court there. I chose to kind of keep that. There was a playground that I kind of chose to expand upon, and that kind of took up like most of the like space on that side of the block. And then with the Grove and the community gardens, I I guess I kind of thought more about like mulch and different like textures with that. And so it ended up being a little bit less of like grass and green than I guess you might imagine. But I guess like my answer to that would just be that I had kind of thought about the different programs first, and then that just kind of happened.
It looks really nice.
Thank you.
But yeah, I just wonder about like stormwater and just I've seen the puddles in this exact location.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of water.
Yeah, so to address the stormwater issue, so the site, the topography on the site kind of goes like this way, and so along the edges, we have bioswales that kind of help to address some of the irrigation that along the edges here.
You know, just you mentioned it. Maybe I misunderstood it, but in the food hall along Oakey Street, did you talk about those being operable doors that could open up? Maybe I missed it. If not, I think you should.
Yeah, I talked about having, so not all of them are operable, but the ones here that align with the demonstration kitchen are, so these two are able to open up into.
Yeah, I just, you know, like if you could imagine Oakey Street becoming, you know, along its entire length, because kind of like one block long, and it could be like the whole street could be this kind of market. Think of Italian market in Philadelphia, where, you know, it turns into this kind of pretty vibrant place. And if that could open up and, you know, along the south side on Oakey Street, that could have, you know, vendors set up, and how you imagine that could be really quite wonderful to extend its, you know, vitality.
I have one more little thing. Okay. Yeah, just one sort of technical learning opportunity. I think what works really well here is that even though it looks like there will be a future large massing on the north side of your greenhouses, it's still gonna get the southern sunlight. But one thing that we do in greenhouses is we orient all the planting north to south so that, yeah, they get more even kind of spread. That's all.
That's good to know.
Congratulations on a really nice project. I think going along with some of the comments about addressing New York Avenue, you've got this alley there, you've got this promenade to a wall. There are wonderful alleys with program in DC that you could think about carving a space just in that section, just so that there is some thought as to what is carrying on through New York Avenue. Like maybe that could be a secondary market area or another dining. I don't really understand the program that's happening on New York Avenue, but alleys can become activated spaces and not just places to drive through. So I think that's something to think about. Another thing to think about is you've got this huge stairs. Is it a scramp with like a ramp and a stair? And I'm just wondering if there was an opportunity to have something happening off of it. Like, could there have been little pockets of cantilevered balconies for places to sit or dine or something, just to use the space a little bit more and to give people a little bit more purpose as they're going up that stair and that ramp?
So actually the new Lexington Market in Baltimore does that exact same thing, where it changes levels from one end of the building to the other, and it has kind of a stramp sort of structure in the middle, and they actually have spaces at sort of different midpoints for different, you know, cart-sized vendors and stuff like that, and they did a good job of incorporating seating so that, you know, it's a big lunch destination, so people are able to go there and stop and pause and sort of watch everything going around. So yeah, I agree that programming that space additionally, as opposed to just being, you know, sort of grand circulation would be a huge help. Yeah, even if, you know, even if we agree that, okay, yeah, there's going to be this gigantic development on New York Avenue at some point in the future, so what? Who cares? And design some way for it to go through or utilize the alley. Right now it's all back of house spaces, sort of directly fronting on the alley space, which is fine from a, you need somewhere to have everything coming in and out. There's a huge production facility, but there could be opportunities, at least, for some points at a time, to actually celebrate that as well. Yeah.
And if she gets her plans in first, they may change their plans to respond to what you're,
Exactly.
I don't know.
And just minor things going back to the sort of food hall elements that are right there along Oakey Street. I think minor here, but expand that section all the way down the court, expand out to include the street as well, and sort of how the street can be activated, different types of year would be great to see.
I agree with all of the comments about the really beautiful professional presentation. It's just kind of like pulling me in. And that is what makes me think that I can poke at it a little bit. Like it's at this such a high level of quality that I think, it deserves these rich conversations. So I think from a kind of cultivation of food perspective, I would imagine spaces like this, and this is a little bit connected to the comment of like the hardscape. I imagine spaces like this would be not what one would define as sterile. They would probably be pretty messy in some ways. That might be part of the aesthetic. Sometimes that's part of what makes things like farmers markets so beautiful and comfortable and familiar. So I guess my question for you is, as you studied spaces of cultivation, was the messiness and the sort of heterogeneity part of the aesthetic in your mind? And if so, like where might that be showing up? I think the other question I have for you is about how you dealt with the topography. And I'm not super familiar with the site and what the topo is doing, but one of the most advantageous things in agriculture is having a slope so that you can have like gravity-fed irrigation and things like that. So I just keep wondering if you could have dealt with some of the topography in the cultivation fields outside, and if that could have been this sort of celebrated part of the design, and if that was discussed and then you said, let's do it in the building instead. So 2 questions for you. I don't know who is next.
Well, thank you. Judy, it's oh, speak.
Yes. So with with the messiness of the activities happening, I think that was something I was trying to figure out how to balance with the formality of the plaza being right there and in front of this very formal building. And so it was kind of me trying to figure out how to keep that while also providing spaces for such a messy activity. And so with the community gardens, at least, they're a little bit off to the side. They're kind of buffered by some trees, and that was kind of, I did consider the messiness of them. I guess I didn't dive into it. And then your topography, yes, irrigation. Yes, so with topography and irrigation, that was something I tried to consider for this part of the Grove. And so we had looked at the Court of Oranges in Cordoba, and how irrigation kind of goes through. And so that was kind of trying to mimic that with the topography on the site.
Okay, I've got a few thoughts. First of all, Thank you. The project is just so well thought through and beautifully represented. I'll just poke at the representation to follow Professor Vandergoot. You've set up a tremendously axial situation, and you have beautiful renderings looking from one building to the other, but I wish that you had rendered them axially. Your images do such a good job of conveying the human perspective, but I think that the human perspective here is going to be walking on the axis, so I would have loved to see that. And I think you could then have some very stable drawings against which to contrast the less formal aspects of this. You know, maybe as Jana said, some of the messiness. So that was point one. Point two, as I think it was Michael mentioned, this is really a wellness project. It's about healing the community through this exercise and food, and it's also about healing the site. I think you're really mitigating a tremendous amount of heat island effect, and you're dealing with stormwater on the site. So I would have gone back and rethought the project title, and I think you still can, because I think you're doing so much more than you probably set out to do initially. So I think it's bigger. It's about wellness for the community and the environment. And finally, okay, I want to quibble with the style of the new building. You have a historic gem on the site. The building that you're proposing, like so much of the architecture in this area, it is from an unidentifiable time period. It's kind of a pastiche. And I think that you have an opportunity to have a dialogue between past and present rather than between past and some uncertain time. So I would have encouraged you, you've probably done this already, to look at markets around the world. Barcelona is my big favorite. There's some very inventive markets there. There's an enormous food market culture going on in that city. And they are, well, at least one of them is a real architectural wonder. So I think you've got a building that has a kind of, you know, integrity, and it stands and speaks about its time. I think that you have an opportunity to think about this time and what this time demands. I don't have the answer for you, but this is an enormous project that you took on. So, you know, maybe this will be something that will play out in your career that you will explore as you go forward. And, you know, I just want to say congratulations. What an achievement.
Thank you so much.
I'm stealing the mic back for a second because every once in a while I actually have a thought. And I just sort of wanted to share something with the reviewers, is that for a good part of the history of this project, everything was occurring south of Oakey Street. And it was starting to clutter up the existing school building. And at probably about the halfway point in the project, Judy started to look at the area north of Oakey Street and to kind of create very much intentionally a wall at that point and make the building focus southward back towards Central Place and towards Ivy City. And now that I see the development of this, I'm wondering if the scale of the building that you ended up with north of Oakey Street is perhaps too large and invites the opposite of, so those well-meaning connections that were talked about up to New York Avenue through an alley were exactly what Judy was trying to prohibit, because the idea was, and Michael, I don't want to say the G word here, but I know how you dance around on that word last time we were here, but there's an intention here to try to do something to stabilize the community to the south, and not to create this thing as a kind of union market too, where everybody in DC starts flocking here, and before you know it, the folks that actually live in this neighborhood have the same reaction that they've had every time something's been done, that there's nothing here for them. So I just sort of wonder, would a STOA have been better with something at the middle that wasn't so overtly referring to the school building, something just a neutral datum across the top, and more modest in scale and more neighborhood in scale and less regional in scale, might have been something that was along that intent to avoid gentrification. You know, it's a tricky thing, and I'm not so certain that making it smaller is going to avoid that either. So
I'm going to disagree with my two colleagues who just spoke ahead of me here, just to have some fun here. You know, I just first with what Madeline said, I guess my issue with the way the building looks is it's a little bit of a Rorschach blot. You can see it more modern or see it more traditional, and I think I would want to see it pushed one way or the other. You know, I think maybe the details are a little bit cartoony, and you'd want to see, if you really were trying to make it like the kind of industrial buildings we know that come out of the past, look at those details and maybe assimilate those better, or not. You know, it sort of resides, it's a little bit of a Rorschach blot. You can kind of see it either way right now. And I think for me, I wouldn't have a problem if it went either way. What would be interesting, though, you know, this project, the Grimke School was just, or not the Grim, what is this called again? Crummel, yeah, Crummel, was just up in front a couple months ago in front of the HPRB in DC, which I sit on, and which has a plan for it to become a community center. I don't know if you've seen it, plan for it to become a community center and all this expansion and stuff. And, you know, one of the challenges of these old school buildings is that they're so small, and if you really want to turn them into something, you have to do a pretty significant addition to them. And the architect who did it chose an overtly modern style, which I didn't particularly care for necessarily the language of it, but in height and in massing and in how it dealt with the building, it was deemed to be compatible and things. What I think you've done here by making this larger thing here, this larger intervention, is you've used the basics of the site of the school to sort of begin to determine a DNA for the larger blocks of the area, which I think is a nice idea. One of the things, I think Brian made an interesting point about the STOA, because this is the temple, the school is the temple, and the STOA could be something which is different than that. On the other hand, you know, you could go inside and find a big room, right? You don't necessarily have to have it expressed on the exterior, and that might have been another strategy. One of the things I really appreciate, though, about strategy is making the big room, because big rooms are cool like that, and they can be used for all sorts of different things. Would I have put a sloped floor in it? I don't know if I would have. It becomes a little bit less flexible when you do that, you know, for different uses. And, you know, were you to have a flat floor, you could have it for all kinds of different community uses, but actually sloping the floor tends to make it less flexible. So that might be something to think about.
vertical circulation up the two sides.
Up the sides, yeah, like at the OAS, yeah, something like that might make the same kind of effect, but have it be more useful. On the whole, the other thing I greatly admire is the idea of elaborating a simple grid. That you don't have to introduce all sorts of diagonals or curvy things or stuff that have no determinate form to make it sophisticated and interesting. And I greatly admire the restraint that site plan shows in terms of organizing this in a coherent way.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to poke at that. There's a precedent that it's very different in scale, but there's this idea of a play garden that I found really poetic and beautiful. It's the Brooklyn Bridge Park in New York. So it takes the idea of the areas of play in a playground and creating like nooks and crannies with the landscaping, the plantings around it. So I think at least in the area where you have the Bosque and the playground, there might have been an opportunity for some messiness between the two. but the rest of the grid's okay.
And one more thing that I didn't realize until now, I see the dotted lines of the building that faces New York Avenue. You probably should have made that massing, because that might have made you react to the building you design in a different way, because that's a pretty big volume. I missed it, you know, all the images you had. Yeah. And so it might have told you to do something different with that building, somewhere between you and yeah, as I said, filling old-fashioned bottles.
That's a great thing about the digital world. Dan, do you want to come up and bring us to conclusion here?
So thank you, Judy, for your presentation. Thank you for a really great conversation. It's been a pleasure working with Judy over the last year. I'm just really impressed by her work ethic, in particular her dedication and commitment to really understanding this place, the history, the community, you know, all the research that went into what came before her. And, you know, I think as Brian alluded to, midway through the semester, we asked her some really tough questions about how she was using the site. And, you know, these questions, I think, might have put some students into a state of crisis, but she handled it like a pro. You know, she came back the next week, just had really considered the questions that we posed to her. And I think what was really great to see was that her process, her hard work that went into all of the initial programming and site planning, I think really, what I think really helped her come to the right response to those questions. So, you know, as Maddie said, this project is also very much about healing a community. This building's been abandoned for over 40 years, and I can only imagine like how many lives would have been positively affected by having a wonderful place like this at the heart of their community. So, Judy, congratulations on a lot of great work.
Thank you.
That's it, folks. We'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. And thank you again to our reviewers.